From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Ambassador Sager, honored guests, good evening. I am Roberta Schaefer, Associate Librarian for Library Services here at the Library of Congress, and yes, I have the pleasure every day of walking through this extraordinary building, taking advantage of our unparalleled collections, and participating in programs like the one that you are about to participate in this evening. There can be no doubt that Jean-Jacques Rousseau's influence on modern-day thinkers still endures. What would Rousseau say is still a question being asked today. Just this past Sunday in the New York Times, Mark Bittman invoked Rousseau's name in a discussion about animal rights. Here at the Library of Congress, we ask the question, what would Dr. Billington say? Although he is a Princeton and Oxford graduate, a Rhodes Scholar, the first and former head of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and a highly respected historian of Russia, for us, he is our leader and the 13th Librarian of Congress. Here at the library, Dr. Billington created the John W. Kluge Center for Scholars and the John W. Kluge Prize in Human Sciences, an award bestowed on a scholar for lifetime achievement in the humanities and the social sciences. He has actively supported the preservation of books, films, and sound recordings, and established the National Book Festival, a celebration of books, reading, and literacy. Please mark your calendars now to attend the 2012 Book Festival, which will be held on September 23rd and 24th on the Mall. Dr. Billington is fluent in Russian, and he is a Francophone, to be sure. He may be one of a handful of people in the audience tonight who would fit right in at Les Amis de Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French restaurant in Moscow. In case you missed the review in the New York Times, it is a place to get good food and a good taste of revolutionary talk. Perhaps the diners and dissenters at Les Amis have read Dr. Billington's book, Fire in the Minds of Men, Origins of the Revolutionary Faith, gaining additional information and inspiration from his scholarly work on revolutionary change. I am certain that they have all read his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Icon and the Axe. Before asking Dr. Billington to the podium this evening, I must ask your indulgence, but he and I will have to leave the program extremely early this evening because we have another commitment upstairs. Fortunately, we will be able to view it on video, but we regret that we will not be here with you for the entire program. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I ask to the podium James H. Billington, Librarian of Congress.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, ambassadors, friends, all of you. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here for this, and I think since Mr. Ambassador, the Ambassador of Switzerland and the Embassy has really made this possible, we're happy to be in partnership with them. I should just say a couple words about Switzerland in general and Geneva in particular. It's very interesting that Switzerland has played a kind of extraordinary role both in the life of this library but in the life of America in general. And that's despite the fact that there is almost no mention of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in among the founding fathers. I had them look into indexes for the Jefferson papers, the Madison papers, which are both here in the library. There's considerable talk about Switzerland, but not much mention of Rousseau. There is a Jean-Jacques who may have influenced some of the key phrases in the Declaration of Independence, but it happens to be Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's one of the more recent discoveries as we're discovering more and more sources of American thought, and also Emmerich de Vittel. Those two were well known to Jefferson, and they're part of Jefferson's library, which you'll be able to see later this evening upstairs as it's been recreated and put together. John Witherspoon, who was the first president of Princeton University, came over from Scotland, and he proposed the Swiss as a model for the federative system already in the Continental Congress, shortly after the 4th of July. I myself, in the book that Roberta has mentioned, wrote a chapter on James Swenson, who is one of the most remarkable creative thinkers. And I divided the revolutionary tradition into three strands, as it were, and each one was part of was responding to one of the three slogans about liberté, égalité, fraternité. Liberty was the most neglected of the revolutionary traditions. They were talking, and that's what Fazi was, in my view, the best exemplar you could imagine. Fraternity tended to be nationalist revolutions, and equality tended to be social revolutions. But the Swiss were, as always, on the side of liberty. But they had another influence, and that was in Russia, where the equality strain, the social revolutionary strain was strong. In fact, it was referred to originally by Dostoevsky, who was very much opposed to this, as the Geneva idea, because they took the fact that, of course, the most famous of Rousseau's title dealt with inequality. So, and they translated the volonté générale as narodная воля, as volia means will in Russian. So it was it also means freedom, but it was a freedom of a different kind. It was a people's freedom. That's what they called it. And that was the first group that actually used the word terrorism, which never occurred during the French Revolution. Terror, yes. Fourism was the term that was used. But this shows the protean influence of Rousseau, which you can see, of course, in the little sampling of material from the library in the other room, which covers both music and, in a sense, romanticism, as he opposed Rameau and the idea that the point of music is harmony rather than melody. He was the unleasher of Italian melody on the French scene. The whole romanticism, which is also expressed in his great novel, the bestseller of the 18th century. So this is a man of many parts. You can see he was even interested in botany, an extraordinary man. The most recent theory that our people were able to find says he was a neo-cynic. People forget that Diogenes was out there with that map looking for an honest man, and he seems to have been in that eternal pursuit, arguing with almost everybody, convinced that man was good but corrupted by society, spinning off ideas that had such different but important and powerful echoes throughout the world. So it's a great honor for us to honor this unique man who was both a representative of the French Enlightenment, but ultimately was rooted very much in Geneva, the model of a society to which he repeatedly returned, where he was born. And the real Geneva idea was probably much more small scale and fishing in a sense for something which our panelists will, I'm sure, throw much light on today. So it's an honor to have them here as such a distinguished group, to have all of you here for this really world-important figure, and to thank you all and wish you a very happy and enjoyable time, remembering that as there's talk much now about are we getting direct democracy. One of the things that, again, that Switzerland gave us was the idea of initiative and referendum, which caught on in the Western states and reinforced the state's vitality in this country, just as it had sustained this wonderful federative tradition that Switzerland is so unique. We did in time of our own bicentennial revolution, we did an exhibit here about the sister republics and the interesting interactions over the years. So it's an honor for us to be sharing this with, and we're now happy to turn, I guess you're going to present, or should I just present with great pleasure and gratitude for helping us make this possible and attracting such a large crowd and such a distinguished group of panelists, the distinguished Ambassador of Switzerland.
Thank you, Dr. Billington, for your kind words of introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, it's such a pleasure to be here and to see how this evening that my colleagues at the embassy, particularly Christine West and Norbert Berlacher, how they have worked on this and to see how this is coming together. So I'm very excited about this evening, this event, this panel discussion. We are particularly excited to be here for several reasons. First of all, because the Library of Congress has a wonderful exhibition. If you haven't had the chance to look at it, it's out there just in the next room, and I understand also there's some more on exhibit downstairs. So if you haven't had a chance yet, look at it. That's one of the reasons why we're particularly excited. I just found out how much Jean-Jacques Rousseau and I have in common. I'm a diplomat, I'm not a revolutionary, and I'm probably not even a thinker, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his early years had aspirations of being a professional musician, although I'm sure his aspirations did not involve an electric guitar. But so that's the one thing that I would like to also highlight at this point is our wonderful cooperation that we had with Dr. Billington in preparing this. Dr. Billington is a great supporter of the French language. I had the great pleasure and honor to be present when he was awarded the award of the Francophonie of the here in Washington, D.C., and he accepted the award with his great language skills in perfect French. So that was very, very impressive. So it's another reason why we're happy to work with you for this evening. And lastly, it is also a great pleasure, of course, because Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideas are timeless. 300 years after his birth, what he had to say about the relationship between the state and us citizens, what we owe the government, what the government owes us, and the social contract, or how we should be governed, resonates until today. And some of the legacy that he has passed on to all of us is still with us today. As we can see in Occupy Wall Street, they have in some ways they have adopted his thinking and his notion of the role of state and citizens. Of course, he was a great provider of quotes. One of my favorites: "I'd rather be a man of paradoxes than a man of prejudices." Or another one: the world of reality is full of limitations, and only imagination is boundless. Of course, there's another quote, not by him, but it says, we were given imagination to console us for what we are not, and we were given a sense of humor to console us for what we are. I'm now happy to introduce, okay, Carol will introduce. Okay. Carol Armbruster will introduce the panel. I'm very glad that we have a distinguished panel, and which came from far away, at least in the case of Guillaume Chenevière, all the way from Geneva. We're very happy that you are here, but also Mrs. Swenson and Mr. O'Day. Please, Carol, thank you very much for having us here, and thank you for moderating this panel. Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us for this evening.
Good evening. I too would like to welcome you to the Library of Congress. I hope everyone has had a chance to look at the display of library materials that we've organized for today's program. It reflects the range and interest and talents of Rousseau, as well as the strengths of the library's collections. At the library, one can find Rousseau's books, poetry, and musical compositions, as well as his work reflected upon and discussed in materials ranging from contemporary pamphlets, newspapers, and correspondence of 18th century Americans to the most current interpretations of the 21st century. And I speak to you that authoritatively as the French specialist, so you can believe that. Rousseau's works were originally written in French, the lingua franca of the time, and in French spread throughout the Western world. His works were also translated and remain influential in French and in languages worldwide. As the Library of Congress, rich in French and other international collections, at the Library of Congress, rich in French and other international collections, Rousseau occupies not an insignificant amount of shelf space here. We have a very good program. I'm very happy to be part of the Francophonie Cultural Festival 2012, a festival that celebrates the French language and French cultures throughout the world. Tonight, we have three speakers to talk to us about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Their backgrounds, interests, and accomplishments are nearly as varied as those of Rousseau himself. Each of our speakers will speak for 20 minutes, after which we will open the floor to questions. I will introduce each speaker individually, and then after everyone has spoken, we will open the floor to questions. I'd like to start with our first speaker, Mr. Guillaume Chenevière, a native of Geneva, is the former director of the French-speaking national television station of Switzerland, Télévision Suisse Romande. Before joining TSR, he was also a sociologist, a journalist, an executive in the automobile industry, and a theater director. After his retirement from TSR in 2002, Mr. Chenevière remained active in the media industry, creating the Media and Society Foundation to implement a universal media quality management standard, and then becoming executive director of the World Electronic Media Forum, which was organized by the European Broadcasting Union and the United Nations Department of Public Information. Mr. Chenevière has published a book of memoirs entitled Je, and is a regular contributor to the Swiss French language daily Le Temps. As a Rousseau enthusiast, he is associated with the project House of Rousseau and Literature. His new book, published just last month, we must show it, is entitled Rousseau, une histoire genevoise. It is about the complex relation between Rousseau and Geneva. He will speak to us today, I just lost your title. He will speak to us today on Rousseau, citizen of Geneva. Mr. Jean?
Thank you very much for these kind words. If you'll allow me, just in addition to my 20 minutes, just to say that when I heard Dr. Billington speak about the relation of Switzerland and this library and the role of Switzerland, it's interesting to see that Switzerland is in fact the most Rousseauist of countries. But it never refers to Rousseau, absolutely never. This is because Rousseau was a Swiss in his mind, you see, and he had the Swiss thinking. So it is rather amusing to see that, and when you see what I'm going to speak about, you will, at least the ambassador will understand what I mean. I spent the last 5 years writing a book about the relation of Rousseau and Geneva, which is extremely complex, and my usual theme is the love affair between Rousseau and Geneva, not the bad part, which everybody knows about, but the love affair. But tonight, due to the subject that we've been asked to treat, I will stick to the political side, but perhaps we can speak of love later on during the evening. So at the end of the 18th century, John Locke, who is with Tom Hobbes the spiritus sanctor of the political, democratic, liberal system that we live in, wrote the following: "The great question which in all ages has disturbed mankind and brought them the greatest part of those mischiefs which have ruined cities, depopulated countries, and disordered the peace of the world, has been not whether there be power in the world, nor whence it came, but who should have it." And to that very question, Rousseau gave an answer that is both strikingly new and particularly relevant to the contemporary issues that we face in the 21st century. Rousseau makes his own, thinks through, and profoundly transforms the political thinking of Hobbes and Locke. He was not followed because he is a difficult and complex thinker. Also, as I think you said, Mr. Ambassador, he is a man, and he says himself, I'm thinking with paradoxes. And by that he means that he does not shun contradictions. He thinks contradictions are very much part of the reality. And also he thinks against the grain. He thinks against the general opinion. So he is perhaps too original to have been followed easily. Yet, 250 years after they have been published, it appears that the discourse on the origins of inequality and the social contract is used by modern political thinkers without realizing that they are walking in the steps of Rousseau. And I would give later one example with Francis Fukuyama. So let us first try to understand what is the trail that Rousseau opened up. You see, Rousseau didn't start writing philosophy until he was 40, approximately 40, was 1750. And he never wrote as a philosopher. He took distance with the philosophical circle. He wanted to speak about philosophical issues as every citizen should do. Before that, Rousseau has been a musician. We've talked about that. He's been a secretary to rich ladies. He's been a frequenter of Parisian salons, a friend of artists and philosophers. He has shown not very much interest in political philosophy, except when he is in Venice, and he notices, because he's a very keen observer of whatever he sees, he notices that the Venetian aristocracy's political organization is very much the same as Geneva's democracy. So he's surprised at that. He thinks, well, maybe we should come back one time to the political institutions. And it is completely by chance that he reads in a newspaper a question raised by the Academy of Dijon as a sort of competition, which I will not give you as it was raised, but I will translate it in modern terms. The question is the following: does the advance of science, technology, and culture in general improve the human condition? Does it make our life freer, happier, more virtuous? And to his own surprise, Rousseau answers with a resounding no, not at all, and is in fact starting a complete condemnation of the whole society in which he lives. And the reason Rousseau is so sure of his answer is because he looks at himself. He left his native Geneva at the age of 15 when he was an apprentice engraver. And for the last 25 years, he has amassed a huge amount of culture and knowledge. Philosophy, science, music, theater, literature. He knows every single thing there is to know, and he's a full-fledged member of the most sophisticated Parisian elite. But he's not a better man than he was as an ignoramus when he left Geneva. And so he immediately starts writing his answer to the Academy's question, and it turns out to be his first major philosophical work. It's called The Discourse on the Arts and Sciences. And he strikes a note of such authenticity that it is immediately a huge success. Diderot says he took Paris par-dessus les nuées, over the sky. And from one day to the other, Rousseau is transformed from a nobody to a Parisian star. But, before I say but, just see how this was, why and how this was felt at the time. You see, Rousseau told the people, do not accept the situation as it is. Be indignant. You cannot, this is unbearable what you see. And I'll just give you an example of one thing he says at the time, which can be heard still today. Our politicians only speak of commerce and money. One speaks of countries where a man is worth nothing, and others speak of countries where men are worth less than nothing. They evaluate men as if they were herds of cattle. For them, a man is no more to the state than the amount he consumes. How could they hope to get citizens in this fashion? And Rousseau is a success. Everybody says, bravo, Rousseau. But Rousseau does not want that. He means it seriously. When the king proposes a pension, he refuses. Nobody understands, thinks he's crazy. He says, I'm going to change my life. He calls it, he uses the word reform. And he calls himself citizen of Geneva, which of course he's not anymore. He left the city at 15. And he decides to show that he is very serious, to become again citizen of Geneva. And he returns to the city, he reclaims his Protestant faith that he had given up by becoming a Catholic, and he is again accepted as citizen of Geneva. So that now he has a real stand to speak for the citizens and not be a philosopher of the court like all the others. But he immediately sets about to teach the Geneva citizens how they should make the best use of their sovereignty. And at the same time, he tells the Parisians how little they have to be proud of and how much better off are the Genevans with their constitution. Rousseau's second important political work, The Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, explains that man is born to be free, and yet he has become something close to a slave everywhere, a slave to his own base instincts and passions, and a slave to the will of others. And he shows that this is not, it's not natural. It shouldn't be like that. Man is born neither good nor bad. He can do whatever he wants. Why has he become like that? Well, this is a very long process I will not describe to you today, but at the end he says, well, very well conceived societies, of which there are very few examples, can possibly return to this freedom, which for him is so essential to a human being. A human being that is not free is not a human being, would say Rousseau. And these examples, there are few in the antiquity, and there is one contemporary, which is Geneva. Now, why Geneva? It's very strange. What is so special about Geneva? Well, there is something, several things, but one thing is very special. Geneva is a city-state where the constitutional power lies entirely in the hands of the people. And that's a very rare case, almost unique. And before, 2 centuries before, under Calvin, Geneva was close to a theocracy. John Knox called it the most perfect school of Christ since the time of the apostles. He was not talking of a monastery, he was talking of the whole city. You can imagine what it was living there with such a calling. And at that time, rich and poor had a very similar way of life. This lasted, in fact, until the end of the 17th century with the sumptuary laws, etc. Everybody was really, and it was seen later on during the 18th century as a sort of golden age when everybody was like brothers to the others. Huh? But since the beginning of the 18th century, that has completely changed, because the reigning de facto oligarchy that was in Geneva had, in fact, entered a totally different universe from the other citizens. They built magnificent mansions in the upper city, even more magnificent mansions with gardens like Versailles in the countryside. And they were totally emerged in the international banking they had recently discovered, which made them live in a global world, in the so-called sort of flat world of the time, and sometimes even at the expense of the local industry. And Rousseau knew about that because between 5 and 10 years, he never went to school. He was living with his father, who was a watchmaker, in his father's workshop, and they were surrounded by craftsmen whom we know by name, we know who they are, and all of them were members of the citizens' opposition party to the oligarchy. So Rousseau got from them these ideas that the legitimacy of the state relies on the people's sovereignty, that freedom means obedience to the law, never to a person, that convenience, that inequality is the source of all evil, that convenience is never an excuse to the suppression of freedom and the denial of justice. Mrs. de Stael said of Rousseau that he invented nothing but inflamed everything. This is certainly true of the case of Geneva. Geneva, you see, does not idealize his native city. When he writes the dedication to the Republic of Geneva of the Second Discourse, of course, this is meant to show the French how excellent the Geneva Constitution is. But in fact, he gets under this dedication. There is a criticism, a very subtle criticism of what happens. Particularly, he criticizes the oligarchy because he realizes that the oligarchy has left the contact with the other people. Look at what he says to the magistrates. He says, "Wealthy and revered magistrates, I regard you as being placed as much above other magistrates as a free people, particularly that free people you have the honor to lead, is placed above the populace of other states. They are educated and sensible men, of whose such false ideas prevail in other countries where they are spoken of as the workers or the people. It is not for me to tell you of the consideration which can rightly be expected by your equals by education and by rights of nature and birth, your inferiors by their own will, and by the preference they owe and accord to your merit, a preference for which you, in turn, owe them gratitude. So you see how Rousseau plays with the equality, inequality. And there is something very essential there. You will never have inequality if among people that do not know each other and respect each other. This is why Rousseau was always saying, if you cannot have very rich people and very poor people, because the contact will not exist. You need to have rich and poor, that's normal, but they should be not too poor and not too rich. That's the main idea. And then the third major work, I think my colleague Swenson is going to talk much more in detail, is the social contract, or rather better with its first titles. Already? Gosh, but I'm only in the middle now. The Principle of Political Rights. This is a meditation on how to exercise the people's sovereignty, and particularly how to obtain, I'll go as fast as I can, to obtain a concurrence of obedience and freedom. Because when he says man is born free and everywhere is in chains, Rousseau does not mean that you have to just do away with the chains. He's thinking that you have to have the right kind of chains. In the very last page he wrote before dying, he describes his love affair with Madame de Warrens. And he shows it as the ultimate experience of freedom because he was held up only by attachments he had chosen, and he could do only what he wanted to do. And I think the description of love is practically the same thing as the description of love as freedom, of course. The same thing as the political freedom, you see, as he saw it. You need people who do only what are only held up by the attachments they have chosen, and they only want what they have decided that they will do. It is not possible today, fortunately for my lady, to develop this very, very subtle and complex thinking of Rousseau. Just stressing 2 points. One, it is deeply influenced by the actual Geneva Constitution and the difficulty of applying it. And B, Rousseau is not an advocate of the people's sovereignty. He is simply saying that it is the condition of the state's legitimacy. No free citizen can obey the law to which he does not freely consent in the common interests that maximizes the individual freedom of each member of society. So Rousseau sees very well the importance of having an elite of competent people to run the government. He believes in meritocracy. But the people, while obeying their magistrates in all practical matters, must absolutely keep control over whether the policies the magistrates follow do correspond to the general good as defined by the citizens. And this proves difficult because the elite thinks it knows best, and it tends to disregard the judgment of the people. The will of citizens, writes Rousseau, and that of government sometimes concur, sometimes fight each other. The combined effect of this concurrence and this conflict puts the whole machinery in motion. So this is a dynamic thing. This is never established, must be always rebalanced and restarted, etc. So to finish, Rousseau offers reflection tools immediately useful to both progressive and conservative minds that are concerned with the challenge of today. Those who believe a new model of society is needed to face the challenges we have to face. Those who worry about the widening gap between the elites and the people. Those who think our society needs more consensus more than confrontation, those who fear the growing inequality as a factor of social disruption, those who believe that a healthy social fabric is essential to the development of a real individual freedom, etc. Just one example, Fukuyama, when he wrote now The Future of History after having written The End of History, whatever he says is taken from Rousseau, although maybe he does not know it. When he says we need to assert the supremacy of democratic politics over economics, when he says we need to end interest groups' domination of politics, when he says we must value global trade and investment only to the extent that they contribute to a flourishing middle class. When he says we need to condemn the elite that allowed the benefit of the many to be sacrificed to that of the few, and money politics that overwhelmingly benefits the wealthy. Rousseau would have said every one of those words. And at the end, I would just say that what Rousseau believes, is that a community of citizens that are both free and equals, led by a shared vision of how to achieve maximum freedom and security of all, is possible, but extremely difficult. It can only be realized if the necessity of such a system becomes apparent to all or to a vast majority of actions. I just finished a book about what happened in Geneva after the death of Rousseau, and I can tell you that this proves both that it is, in fact, to a certain extent possible, although very difficult, but in the case of Geneva, it did fail in the end. Sometimes because for external reasons we cannot explain now. But anyway, it is a theme of meditation. As the historian Duvernois said in 1789, if you admire the principle of life as much in a worm as in an elephant, you will find a great occasion of meditation in the history of Geneva at that time. Thank you.
Thank you. We move to the second speaker, Michael Audet. Michael Audet is Professor Emeritus of French at the University of Lyon 2, where he taught from 1999 to 2010. Previously, he taught at Carysford College in Dublin and then at the University College Dublin. He holds a PhD in comparative literature from Brown University. From 2009 to 2011, Professor Audet was president of the Rousseau Association, and since 2010, he has been a committee member of the Société Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He has been on 2 tricentennial exhibition committees on Rousseau, serving first as Joint Commissioner for the exhibition Jean-Jacques Rousseau entre Rhône et Alpes at the Municipal Library of Lyon. That is a current exhibition running through June 30th of this year. And second, as a member of the advisory committee, specifically responsible for music and opera, for the exhibition Rousseau et les Arts, a forthcoming exhibition at the Pantheon in Paris. It runs from July 1st through September 30th. Professor Audet has written 3 books on Rousseau's influence on political philosophy, education, and music. He recently edited 2 volumes of the Studies on Voltaire and the 18th Century series concerning Rousseau, volumes entitled Rousseau et les philosophes and Rousseau en 2012, puisqu'en face, mon nom doit vivre. Professor Audet?
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, let me say first of all that it's an honor to come and speak in this great library. I'm here, Carol mentioned the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Society of Geneva, and I'm here in fact to represent that society, however inadequately. It's a learned society that has really played an exceptional role. It was founded at the very beginning of the 20th century. One of its founding members was Tolstoy. and among its presidents have been the great scholars of what's known as the Geneva School, of whom perhaps the most notable of all is Jean Starobinski, who's a former president of the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Society, and who is, I suppose, the preeminent figure in Rousseau scholarship, certainly in the second half of the 20th century, and indeed at the beginning of the 21st, because at the age of 92, he's still working away and has a book coming out shortly on Diderot. So, as I say, however inadequately, I'm here to represent that society. I was asked to speak about France in my remarks, so I'm going to start in Moscow, but I will get to France a little later on. You may wonder how somebody called Michael O'Day is called on to speak on France. In fact, I'm a nomadic Irishman, like a lot of Irishmen, love coming to the US, and I do have French citizenship, if that's a qualification that's required. So, in fact, when I was asked to come and speak here, just at that same time, I came on a reference to Les Amis de Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Moscow restaurant that has already been mentioned, the one that has become a gathering place for the young Russian intelligentsia who would like to see their country develop in a somewhat different way from the way that it perhaps seems to be going in at the moment. And in many ways, I think the name is a coincidence. Apparently, the owner is called Monique Rousseau, which is a little bit disappointing. So there was that sort of practical connection. But it did raise the question for me, people who are involved actively in seeking political change, whether in solidifying democracy where it exists, bringing it into being where it doesn't exist, or resisting attempts to undermine it where that is the problem. How much does Rousseau's name mean to them today? And beyond the name, what kind of connection can we make? Now, soon after I started thinking of this, I heard an interview on French radio with the philosopher Michel Serres, who I think is quite well known in the US. He taught for a long time at Stanford. And he was asked essentially the Occupy Wall Street question, which it so happens that Occupy Wall Street and Rousseau's 300th anniversary have fallen in the same year. So he was asked the Occupy Wall Street question. Was there a connection? Could it be said that Rousseau's thought was intended to inspire movements of that kind? And Serres' answer was absolutely categorical and uncompromising. He said no. He said no, absolutely not. Rousseau was a philosopher who progressively put in place a philosophical system through his great works, and who quite clearly stood back from any direct political involvement himself. And that is certainly true for France, where he was a foreigner, where he behaved cautiously. It, of course, isn't entirely true for Geneva, for his native city. But that was Serres' position on the question, and it made me draw back a little bit too and try to rethink it. And I started looking at various situations beyond the Russian one, which is a little bit anecdotal, I suppose. And I did think a little bit about Tunisia, because Tunisia is a country where there is a constituent assembly actually meeting at the moment to provide the new country that has emerged from under dictatorship, to provide that country with its constitution. And there you can hear certain echoes of Rousseau. I was particularly struck by the program of a movement which drew up a draft constitution, a movement called Du Sturm, who proclaimed, this is my translation from their French, civil society will no longer be the ideological mouthpiece of a dominant class, but the inspiration of a real social contract that everyone must respect and that provides the frame for negotiating all conflicts of interest and social divergencies. And it seems to me that there is something of Rousseau there beyond simply the reference to the social contract, which, if you like, is an easy one to make and doesn't necessarily correspond to a direct a direct influence of Rousseau. But what I think is significant is the idea of an illegitimacy of certain forms of power and of the necessity to wrest power away from those illegitimate forms and to provide through a social compact the possibility to start again on a new basis. You can see that if you compare what you read in Rousseau's second discourse on inequality, which Monsieur Chenevière has already referred to. At the beginning of the second part of the discourse on inequality, Rousseau writes, "The first man who placed a fence around a piece of land and said, 'This is mine,' was the true founder of civil society." And it's a terrible phrase, a terrible sentence. There's something chilling about it. All the more so as he goes on to say that there was nobody who stepped forward and said to this usurper, who, if you like, had just invented private property, there was nobody who stepped forward and said to him, "The fruits belong to everyone, and the earth belongs to no man." So that what you get there, I think, is an assertion of the illegitimacy of much political power. And if you move forward towards the end of the discourse of inequality, which for me is the most brilliant, the most remarkable, the most original of all of Rousseau's writings, if you move forward, you see more specifically how, according to Rousseau, social institutions came into being. As human beings complexified and developed their relations, as they had more and more contact with one another, but without any institutions, their situation became perilous and violent. And in this situation, a powerful and wealthy man came forward and proposed an agreement to set up legal institutions to govern the nascent society that he envisaged. And Rousseau makes it clear again that this operation is a kind of fraud. It's a kind of confidence trick which is intended solely to protect the interests of the man who makes the proposal. And the situation has become so bad that around him people are willing to accept something that in fact is going to deprive them of whatever minimal possibilities of peace and tranquility they might have had. So Rousseau's thought, let's make no mistake about it, is radical thought. And just the other day, Dr. Billington spoke of Jefferson. Just the other day, I came on a sentence of Jefferson's which made me think of some sentences of Rousseau's. This is from a letter that Jefferson wrote when he was in Paris about France. "If anybody thinks that kings, nobles, or priests are good conservators of the public happiness, send them here." Now, you get something of that. I said Rousseau was discreet in his political pronouncements concerning France specifically, and I think that's true. But you get something of that in Rousseau, in the sense that several times he compares what life is like for the French peasant living in misery and what life is like for the Swiss peasant living with a modest sufficiency. There's a point in the Nouvelle Héloïse where he compares the two shores of Lake Geneva, the Savoy side, which in fact wasn't part of France at the time, but was under a monarchical government, the Kingdom of Piedmont. He compares the two shores of Lake Geneva, one cultivated, prosperous, abundant, and the other running to rack and ruin. Why? Because of a political system that is entirely designed to siphon off money and feed it up into the higher reaches of society at the cost of misery for everybody else. That's what Jefferson is saying, and Rousseau saw that, and in his own way he denounced it. But he denounced it, I think, by taking a step back. He denounced it in philosophical terms. He decried the type of institutions that arise out of the illegitimate taking of power by the privileged, and he offered a vision of a different kind of society founded on the social contract that has already been referred to and that will certainly be spoken about by Professor Swenson as well. Now, what about France in all of this? What I'd like to suggest, I don't know how much time I have left, but 5 minutes. What I'd like to suggest is that there, in a rather diffuse way, there is some kind of Rousseauistic heritage in French politics. And again, I'd link it up with the whole issue of equality and inequality. Now, I'm certainly not going to suggest, certainly not in a building called the Jefferson Building and just after quoting Thomas Jefferson, that France has a monopoly on the ideal of equality. There are self-evident truths that were pronounced in the American Declaration of Independence. But I think that something happens in France, I'm not sure when, and it may be actually at quite a late stage. It may actually be in the sort of resurrection of France after the humiliation of occupation under and the whole Vichy regime, all that period in the Second World War. Now, it's linked, obviously, to the great slogan of liberty, equality, and fraternity that Dr. Billington referred to. And I think that the resonance of equality in modern France has been particularly strong. It's been particularly strong, and it has increasingly been interpreted as a demand for social and economic equality, rather than simply equality of rights before the law, which I suppose was, you could say, was the essential meaning of the term in the 18th century. And it seems to me, I'm venturing into areas that may take me onto slightly marshy ground, I'm not sure. We can talk about it further in the discussion. But it does seem to me that there is something there in France, a concern for equality that is particularly marked. Rousseau's analysis of inequality has already, as I think you may have seen from what I said, a very strong economic as well as political dimension. The argument of the discourse is this: our natural physical inequalities are relatively insignificant. One person may be a bit stronger, a bit more adroit, a bit more intelligent than another. But what happens in a poorly organized society is that these inequalities become grossly inflated by the social system, so that we reach a point where, as Rousseau says, one person claims to own another person. In other words, that the ultimate form of inequality is reached when slavery is regarded as an acceptable mode of relation between human beings. And this, of course, he denounces radically. So, I'm not going to suggest that France is a sort of haven of equality. I'm not going to suggest that there are no poor people in France. You've only to go to Paris, you'll see beggars in the street. I'm not going to suggest either that there are no rich people in France, because there are some very rich people in France. But I think, nevertheless, that there are some specifics there. Just to talk about today and some specific facts, the total tax take in France amounts to 44% of national product. That's the highest figure of any country in the European Union. And in relation to some countries, it's very substantially higher. There are countries in the European Union that are around the high 20s, low 30s. So it's a big difference. It's a major redistributive intention that's expressed in that way. In the current political debate in France, because as you know, like the US, but a little earlier, France has a presidential election this year, the socialist candidate, who may well be the next president of France, François Hollande, has proposed a taxation, an income taxation rate of 75% over 1 million euros, which is about 1,300,000 or $400,000, something like that. All income over that level would be taxed at 75%. There's a wealth tax in France, which means that you're taxed not only on what you earn, but also on what you own. And one of the difficulties of President Sarkozy as he goes into his re-election campaign, as many of you will know, is that he early on, after his election, got the label attached to him of being the rich man's president, notably because of a taxation package which was favorable to high earners. So there's quite a strong pressure, it seems to me, in this area in France. And I think there you can link that concern for reducing inequalities, reducing financial and economic inequalities. You can link it back to Rousseau in this way, that I think something that is clearly shown in the discourse on inequality is that for Rousseau, the more unequal a society is, the more you can be sure that its institutions are flawed and problematic. And the more likely it is that you have to start again on the basis of some new compact. So there, as I say, I remain in perhaps somewhat uncertain ground, perhaps speaking a little bit impressionistically, but I do think there are some signs there that show that the concern for inequality, in Rousseau's sense of the word, is probably stronger today in France than in almost any other European country. So are we friends with Jean-Jacques Rousseau? That was the title I'd suggested earlier on. If we means the French, if I'm speaking as a French person, then I think to some extent the answer is yes. And in a curious way, one could also say that the French people are more friends with Jean-Jacques Rousseau than at the time of earlier celebrations of anniversaries of his birth. In 1912, there were scuffles in the street between admirers of Joan of Arc, whose 500th anniversary it was, and admirers of Rousseau, whose 200th anniversary it was. I don't think this year in Paris, we're celebrating the 600th anniversary of the birth of Joan of Arc. I don't think there'll be any scuffles in the street. And I think, again, that something happened in France that reinforced Republican solidarity, a conviction of the necessity and the value of Republican government after the Second World War, and that has worked to harmonize and unify to some extent the country, to heal a certain number of historical divides, and to ensure that even if Rousseau is still perhaps seen to some extent in France as a man of the left, he is nevertheless somebody around whom a broad social consensus exists. Thank you very much.
Our third and final speaker is James Swenson. Professor Swenson is Dean of Humanities and Associate Professor of French and Comparative Literature at Rutgers University. He is the author of the book On Jean-Jacques Rousseau, considered as one of the first authors of the Revolution. He is also the translators of 5 books by contemporary French political philosophers, including Jacques Rancière and Étienne Balibar. Currently, Professor Swenson is working on a project on conceptions of the relation between society and politics in the era of the French Revolution. The project is entitled Republican Institutions. His title tonight, and I apologize to Michael all day for getting to mention his, Professor Swenson's title is Liberal and Conservative Egalitarianisms in Rousseau. Professor Swenson.
recording? Okay. I'll keep one of them close to me then. I'd like to thank the library and all of its personnel and the Swiss Embassy and all of its personnel for having done me the honor and given me the pleasure of coming before you all this evening to talk about Rousseau. The enduring importance of Jean-Jacques Rousseau for modern political culture stems to a large extent from the way in which his thought often seems to run against the grain of the political institutions he did so much to inspire. His works contain numerous and famously ringing pronouncements, beginning with the opening lines of The Social Contract, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains," that still echo across the centuries. Rousseau's works have consistently reminded us of the unconditional priority of liberty over other political goods, and his words have been clarion calls to individual and collective action in pursuit of this fundamental goal. At the same time, there are few major figures in the history of political thought about whose lessons there is less agreement, whether in a purely scholarly context or in terms of the pragmatic influence that has been attributed to their works. In his insistence on the inalienable character of popular sovereignty, Rousseau is the most radically democratic thinker to emerge from the natural rights tradition in the 18th century. He is also a classical Republican whose conception of what makes for an enduring society is grounded in the defense of small, socially and morally homogeneous city-states against the highly differentiated territorial monarchies that are the direct ancestors of our modern nation-states. At the center of this conflict is Rousseau's conception of equality, which appears in very different guises as the rigorous and formal presupposition of the rule of law and as the substantive but merely prudential basis for social cohesion. If Rousseau's political egalitarian moves in a liberal direction, his social egalitarianism is part of the conservative strand of his thought, where it is closely connected with his promotion of traditionalist gender norms and the importance of a common religious culture. The first critic to focus on this configuration within Rousseau's thought was the Swiss writer Benjamin Constant in a pamphlet entitled On the Liberty of the Ancients Compared to That of the Moderns. Constant argued that Rousseau had made a historical mistake in proposing for economically differentiated modern societies an ideal of liberty that was better suited for the small, undifferentiated, and oligarchical, not to mention slaveholding, city-states of the ancient world. He saw Rousseau as being inspired by an ideal of participatory democracy, best expressed by the Aristotelian alternation of ruling and being ruled that defines us as political animals in Greek thought. I will refer to this aspect of Rousseau's thought as republican. It stands as one of the high points of a tradition that moves from the ancients through Renaissance Italy to 17th century England and 18th century America. In Constant's view, modern societies required an ideal that Isaiah Berlin would later call negative liberty, that is, individual freedom from interference. I will refer to this conception as liberal. This is the sense in which the Europeans refer to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher as liberal rather than the American use. This liberalism stems from the natural law tradition, which was developed to argue in favor of religious toleration by thinkers such as John Locke. You no doubt have already noticed that the terms liberal and republican, as I've defined them here, have no immediately apparent connection with contemporary American politics. And my goal this evening is to try to give some background to the conceptual continuities that underlie this apparent contradiction. I will begin by separating two contrasts that Constant's argument identifies. The first is between foundations or ideals of liberty, and the second is between historical forms of the state. The first question is perhaps the most contested issue in Rousseau scholarship, and it would far exceed the time available this evening for me to lay out the various arguments. I'm going to try to state as concisely as I can what I think Rousseau's position is and emphasize the limits of that position, by which I mean what it doesn't claim to explain. We will then see in a second moment that those limits are described by the second question. I've already described Rousseau's doctrine of sovereignty in the social contract as a radicalization of the liberal or natural rights tradition. Like every other thinker in this tradition, Rousseau recounts a rather mythical history in which pre-political individuals come together and form a political state in order to provide security for their individual rights of life, liberty, and property, or the pursuit of happiness, in a particularly important American formulation. The most important difference between Rousseau and other thinkers in this tradition, in my view, is that Rousseau's thought is not fundamentally legal in form. What I mean by this is that while property is an essential right, and perhaps the essential right for Rousseau, it is not the form of right. I have a right to my property and a right to sell, that is, alienate my property. But my right is not itself a property that can be alienated. The natural rights tradition as a whole, in my view, conceives of the sovereignty, that is, the right of self-determination, that results from the social contract, as a right that has the form of a property and can therefore itself be alienated, whether conditionally or unconditionally. In pragmatic terms, this argument serves primarily to justify the legitimacy of a transfer of sovereign power from the people to a monarch, and secondarily to determine the conditions under which it is legitimate for the people to attempt to reclaim their original right, or in other words, to constitutional limitation of the transferred sovereign power. This is, in some sense, a summary of Locke that I'm trying to give you here. Rousseau's argument is that the sovereignty of the people is inalienable. It is not a property that can be sold or otherwise transferred, for the same reasons that slavery, which is classically thought of in legal terms as the alienation of my right in my person in exchange for the right to kill me that the victor has acquired on the battlefield, can never be legitimate. At bottom, Rousseau's argument is that such a transfer is actually impossible. Neither an individual nor a people can cease to have a will that is directed at their own well-being. You can prevent me from exercising my right to self-determination, but you cannot take away that right, nor can you take that right away from a people. Every legitimate state, for Rousseau, is based upon inalienable popular sovereignty as expressed in what he called the general will. This collective right of self-determination is in many ways redoubtably absolute, whence the interpretation of Rousseau as illiberal or even totalitarian that was advanced by thinkers during the Cold War. The general will cannot recognize a limitation by another will. Its only limitation is internal, in the relation between individual and collective self-determination. Rousseau expresses this limitation as the identity of sovereignty with legislative power. If the law is the expression of the general will, in the formulation given by the French Declaration of Rights, the general will can express itself only in the form of law. Law, for Rousseau, is general in both form and content. It expresses the will of the collectivity as it applies equally to all citizens, taken as individuals. What this means in turn is that Rousseau proposes a vigorous distinction between sovereignty and government, between law and its execution. Rousseau's general will is radically democratic. He considers a representative legislature to be an illegitimate alienation of sovereignty. He considers a representative legislature to be an illegitimate alienation of sovereignty, so that all legislation necessarily involves the entire people in person. But the executive function can be confided to a wide range of forms of government. Rousseau prefers what he calls elective aristocracy, that is to say, the selection by the people of those best suited to govern, but monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy are all possible forms. Now, most of the acts of our Congress would, for Rousseau, be considered functions of government rather than legislation. His theory of sovereignty implies a radical limitation of the scope of legislative activity by the formal equality inherent in the notion of law. You can only make laws that are absolutely the same for everybody. They're only laws if they're absolutely the same for everybody. Otherwise, they're acts of government. This theory, this political egalitarianism makes no claim for substantive equality. It is revolutionary in its insistence on the absolute rights of the people against the government, and democratic in its participatory demands, but liberal, in quotation marks, in the sense I've already defined, in that it functions above all as a protection of individual rights under law by building those rights into the structure of law itself and denying the character of law to governmental action that does not protect individual liberty in this way. In Isaiah Berlin's terms, but against his famous argument, we can say that Rousseau considers positive liberty to be the best and, in the end, the only guarantor of negative liberty, that is, the private pursuit of happiness, according to each individual's own lights. Now, Rousseau's argument, as I've tried to summarize it so far, takes up not much more than a third of the social contract. It is without a doubt the most influential as well as the most controversial part of the book, but it exists within a larger context to which I will now turn. The second half of the social contract is concerned in the first place with the variety of forms of government, and secondly with the relation between civil society and the state. Rousseau responds to the perennial question of the best form of government by observing that there are as many answers as there are nations. A great deal of what he has to say here is drawn fairly directly from his great predecessor, Montesquieu. Both of them consider appropriate forms of government to vary with a combination of physical and moral factors, such as climate and character. Both of them approach the question primarily from a descriptive rather than a normative point of view, so that the primary criterion for appropriateness is the stability of the state. Indeed, if we have characterized the first part of the social contract as a revolutionary liberalism, the second half can be described under the sign of conservative republicanism. And once again, the terms are very crossed from what they mean today. From a discussion of rights, contract, and legitimacy, Rousseau moves to a discussion of virtues, institutions, and effectiveness. As is appropriate given his concern with pragmatic results rather than questions of principle, the argument is less tight in a logical sense, so I'm not going to try to schematize it this time. I'm going to instead comment very briefly, I hope, on a handful of interrelated themes: the ancients and the moderns, gender and religion, and finally, egalitarianism. Now, Constant was certainly correct to discern a preference in Rousseau for the classical republics. He was particularly susceptible to the lure of Spartan or Roman heroism, as recounted by Livy or Plutarch. The idealized Geneva of his childhood, even though he could be scathingly critical of the actual functioning of oligarchical government, reinforces the attraction of the Republican city-state as a form. The structure of office holding, however, is probably the least important element here. If the Republican municipality is opposed to the territorial monarchy, the most crucial distinction is that of scale. The Republic is a proximate community, and the monarchy a differentiated society. In the Republic, it is possible for a citizen to situate each of his peers in a network of relations that is part of his direct experience, and the effect of moral censure provides a strong motive for virtuous behavior. In a monarchy, the subject's relations with his peers are mediated either through the state, as embodied in the king, or through depersonalized economic exchange, and only the threat of punishment serves to deter crime. More than a form of government, the Republic is the shared life, the shared way of life of a moral community. This shared way of life expresses itself with particular strength in the structure of the family unit. Rousseau considered the strict separation of gender roles to be one of the mainstays of Republican life. Feminine chastity ranks high among Republican virtues. His revulsion at the sexual morality of the 18th century French nobility, décolletage is a French word for 18th century reasons. His revulsion at the sexual morality of the 18th century French nobility led him to champion an alignment of male and female with public and private spheres, which had a deep influence on 19th century middle-class culture and has made Rousseau's name anathema among many contemporary feminists. In my view, what is important here is not the content of these spheres, even though Rousseau certainly believes certain gender norms to be natural, as their distinction and clarity. A similar configuration can be seen in Rousseau's discussion of the relation between religion and politics. In one of the most notorious chapters of the social contract, Rousseau claims that a free government cannot be neutral in matters of religion and must promote what he calls a civil religion. In my view, however, this civil religion cannot be identified as a state religion. Rousseau clearly differentiates it not only from Christianity as such, but from what he calls the national religions of the ancient world. It is rather a shared religious culture that is strong enough to be capable of transferring sacrality to the nation and loose enough to encompass all of the forms of religion actually present within the national community. Again, while Rousseau considers atheism to be deeply unnatural, the importance of the civil religion derives from its common character rather than from its truth. Finally, it is at this level that Rousseau's social egalitarianism appears. Rousseau's economic ideal is self-sufficiency, both at the level of the nation and at that of the individual. A nation that is dependent on foreign trade, whether the balance of trade be positive or negative in Rousseau's view, is doomed to lose its freedom. Individuals as well cannot be free if they are dependent, as a thoroughgoing division of labor will inevitably lead them to be. A free man can support himself and his family. It is for this reason that the Republic is a roughly egalitarian society. Rousseau defines this rough social equality as one in which, quote, no citizen is wealthy enough to be able to buy another, nor poor enough to be forced to sell himself, unquote. Now, this certainly implies some sort of redistributionist agenda, but Rousseau never turns equality into a right. It is rather a matter of prudential and pragmatic politics. Conceptually, freedom only requires the barest formal equality. But if you would preserve your liberty, you would be well advised, Rousseau tells us, to limit inequality. Now, I've tried to emphasize the co-presence here of themes dear to both the right and the left of the American political spectrum at various levels of Rousseau's thought. It is, in my view, precisely the impossibility of categorizing him in contemporary terms that makes him useful for thinking about our current situation. This doesn't mean Rousseau provides answers. I think he does much more to unsettle our certainties and to pose some unexpected questions. If I began the project by thinking about Rousseau in the light of the Occupy movement, I finished it thinking much more about Charles Murray's Coming Apart. Our society would appear incomprehensibly large and economically differentiated to Rousseau, although it's not necessarily more inegalitarian than 18th century France. To that, we can add a range of religious experience that is difficult to contain within the bounds of the ecumenical Protestantism that was Rousseau's own faith and that long embodied a sort of civil religion here in the United States. And there's a very little chance of turning back the clock on the last century's revolution in gender relations. We have many, many freedoms, but our inability to imagine a moral community that contains all of those freedoms threatens our ability to preserve them. Thank you.
Now, aren't you glad you came? Really, we've had three very, very good, interesting, and stimulating papers on Rousseau. We have occupied Rousseau. Rousseau is occupying us. And I personally don't know how to begin to really give an overview of all this. But the individual speakers with the different tactics certainly have given us a lot to think about of both historically and how this major, if not the most important political thinker in the Western tradition has really affected us today, and what we're thinking about equality, inequality, and all the different facets of Rousseau's philosophy and what we're worrying about in our current politics. We do have some time for questions, and I strongly encourage you to ask them. We can start with you.
You mentioned his interest in ancient communities, specifically Sparta, and there are totalitarian critics concerned certain totalitarian overthrows and it's been years since I've read Rousseau, so please correct me, but isn't it true that he was deeply influenced by Plato's Republic laws, and which
Would you like to respond?
I think that what I've tried to emphasize is the fact that there are several sides to Rousseau's thought here, and that lining them up is not necessarily easy, okay? So that I would probably distinguish in particular, just in rough terms, between a political vision and a social vision, right? Rousseau's argument, I think, fundamentally is that political freedom needs to be supported by a particularly dense, traditional social fabric, right? And if his account of what liberty is and how we get to liberty and why it's important is fundamentally revolutionary and justifies and has justified the overthrow of numerous traditional regimes, his account of how you preserve liberty is very, very traditionalist, right? And it is indeed the case that he had read Plato fairly carefully. The laws is much more important than the Republic, most likely. He is, as I think I made fairly clear, drawn to Sparta. And one of the things that, always ends up in these discussions about Sparta is precisely a certain configuration of gender relations, which were unique in Sparta compared to other places in Greece. I think that the most important point is, in fact, that a society enjoys liberty when it can preserve its liberty when its customs are supported by this sort of traditional acceptance, right, that is best characterized for Rousseau by the common culture of the ancient republics, but also by a religious community in the broad sense, right? Now, his conception of the civil religion is fiercely tolerantist, right? The primary requirement, the primary doctrine of the civil religion is that you can't say that you have to agree with me to be able to go to heaven, right? That's doctrine number one, basically. So I do not think that the totalitarian reading of Rousseau is at all correct. I think it's much more that there's something much more traditional and pre-modern there, and totalitarianism is a distinctly modern phenomenon. Rousseau's thought on these matters is much more backward-looking.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to at least maybe each make a comment if you want, or would you like to say a few words?
I'll say an initial word perhaps on that. It's obviously an important question, and we've just been using the word totalitarian. I think that we have to say that the French monarchy before the revolution was absolutist but not totalitarian, in the sense that it wasn't sufficiently efficient and unified to impose its will systematically throughout the kingdom and to control completely the flow of ideas. So if you look at the career of Voltaire, he spends much of the later part of his life near the border with Geneva in order to be able to escape safely if condemnation and an arrest warrant were to fall. If you look at Rousseau, he is actually condemned for the publication of Émile and has to leave France in a hurry. But throughout the period, and perhaps this is really the key to the thing, throughout the period when he is in exile and in difficulty, he always has support from members of the aristocracy, and notably from Malesherbes, who was the chief book censor of the kingdom. So, you know, it was an ambiguous situation. It was not, as I say, not a totalitarian situation, and not a situation where a single government apparatus applied a single policy uniformly over a long period. The French Revolution.
I wrote a book on this. The French revolutionaries talked about Rousseau a lot. They constantly referred to him in their speeches. The question of how much he inspired the revolution is another issue. The causes of the revolution are largely political and fiscal. The debt that the French monarchy ran up in supporting the American Revolution was what basically brought it down. That's the origin of the French debt, and that's what brought the French government down was its debt. It couldn't finance its debt, which has very little to do with Rousseau. But once the revolution gets going, the debates about what's a constitution, what's the relation between legislative and executive, should we have a veto, all the sort of constitutional issues are largely debated in terms drawn from Rousseau and other Enlightenment thinkers.
Did you want to make a comment?
I might just add one thing. You see, the king you referred to who said, "L'État c'est moi," is Louis XIV. And he made a very bad mistake when he revoked the Edit de Nantes, which let the Protestants practice their faith, because he wanted to control not only the bodies of his people, but also his souls. And he decided they must be Catholic because I'm Catholic. Because at that time, and contrary to what he had been led to believe, 200,000 people left France, and these people left France not only with their skills, with their crafts, with their entrepreneurial spirits, but with their money. They found a way to get the money out. And then there was this huge money of the Protestants that one didn't know how to use. And it turned out that Louis XIV needed money to finance his wars against the whole of Europe. And that's how the French public debt started. And so, oddly enough, he became indebted to the Protestants. And this is exactly what happened at the end. It's the Geneva bankers were playing a very big part in that. And in the end, the French Revolution came about because there was absolutely no way to repay this huge public debt that had started with the Protestant money that Louis XIV could easily have kept in France.
We have a question up front here. Well, okay. You'll next.
A dog?
Yes, well, I mean with respect. When you look at the lives of some of these thinkers, Freud had a dog.
Yes,
Rousseau's dog was named Turk.
No, he had two dogs. One was called Turk. Yeah. And not only did he have a dog, but he loved his dog. He had two dogs. One of them was called Turk, as you mentioned. He was in fact called Duke. But when he went to the Duke of Luxembourg, it was a little embarrassing to call him Duke, so he called him Turk instead. And when Turk died, it was a tragedy. But then, later on in the years, he found another dog called Sultan, in memory of a dog he had known when he was a little boy. And he was living after his father left Geneva, and it's a complicated story. Anyway, he had a dog there he was attached to, and so he found a new Sultan. And Sultan came to England when Rousseau went to England with Hume, and he had left Thérèse. I don't want to compare Thérèse and his dog, but anyway, without Thérèse, he was very much lost, so he kept to his dog. And there's a famous moment. Hume didn't understand anything about Rousseau at all. No? I don't think Rousseau understood anything about Hume either. But these two great philosophers never exchanged a word about philosophy between them, never. But the dog came in because Hume had managed to present Rousseau to the whole court and the whole nobility of England. So they imagined it in this fashion that Mrs. Garrick, David Garrick was a great actor of the day, Mrs. Garrick would give a special performance. She would invite Rousseau in her, how do you say loge in English? I don't know, anyway.
Box.
In her box. And in the box facing the Mrs. Garrick's box would be the king and the queen, and the rest of the court was there, etc. So it was the biggest event ever. And then Hume came to fetch Rousseau at his place, and Rousseau says, "Oh, no, but I'm not coming." And Hume said, "Well, of course you are coming, and you cannot, but you must come." And Rousseau said, "No, because I cannot leave my dog. If I leave my dog, he'll find a way to escape, and I don't want to risk that." So after a long conversation, Hume finally managed to say to Rousseau, "But we can lock the room." So they locked the room, and then they went away, and then one could hear the dog howling, and Rousseau said, no, that I cannot do, I will not come. You see. So it ended that Rousseau did finally come, but after the dog's affair, Hume could just not stand Rousseau anymore.
We have a question in the front here.
All of your talks is very thought-provoking, and just taking off from one of the things from Mr. Chenevière's saying about the near-death comment about Madame de Baron and how that connects love and politics. And I think that opens up a whole question, which is always dangerous, about the personal life of the author and the ideas. But certainly Rousseau invited that. And I just wanted to ask you about the traumatic experience right at the beginning of really hating his apprenticeship and feeling a kind of slavery and trapped by that. So I wanted to ask you how important the whole idea was to sort of work as something free and unalienated was to Rousseau.
Well, I think we must understand that Rousseau's childhood is complicated because he started as a child in the upper town, which was where the rich lived. His mother was not really rich, but she had a lot of money, you see. And his mother was very beautiful, and she had, I'm going to say she had an affair. No, not an affair. An exchange of letters with a married citizen. But for the Geneva of the time, that was much too much. The two were severely reprimanded by the pastors and so on and so forth. And so when Rousseau's father, who was a poor watchmaker, really, did come and ask her hand, the family said, "Oh, yes, fine, take her." And so he made a good marriage. And for the first 5 years of his life, Rousseau lived in the upper city, and he was not a member of the oligarchy, but he was still on the higher echelon. Then his father moved down because he didn't have any money, he couldn't continue occupying the house, and he sold it. So they went down to the craftsman section. And at that time, you see, a grandfather of Rousseau, David Rousseau, had been a very, very strong member of the opposition party. He's been blamed and punished several times by the politicians of the time and so on. And so there, the father of Rousseau, who had been away during most of these events, because if the father of Rousseau had to go to Turkey to earn his life, so he was not so much involved in these complicated political affairs. But all the people surrounding it were like that. So Rousseau heard a lot about, you are a sovereign, we must keep our rights, etc. In fact, the year Rousseau descended with his father from the upper city to the lower city is the year when appeared in Geneva a very important document called the Anonymous Letters, which were written, in fact, by a pastor. But they were, in fact, the breviary of the revolutionaries in Geneva. And, in fact, we are practically sure that Rousseau had a copy with him of these anonymous letters and used them when he wrote the social contract, because there are quotations that are practically word by word, so he cannot have just remembered that from his childhood. But you see, all this impressed him a lot. And then his father has this fight with a patrician and has to leave Geneva. And so Rousseau moves up again in the upper city, because it is his mother's brother that takes him under his hand, and then he goes with his cousin Bernard. They go to be sort of scholars at a clergyman. They are pensionnaires, you see. The clergyman doesn't have any money, and he takes these two boys. But that's an aristocrat's, almost an aristocrat's life. I mean, being, educated suddenly by a clergyman. So it was a complete change. Then suddenly Rousseau was treated like a man from the pampered circles, And then this finishes, and Rousseau said, I want to be a clergyman myself, because I think very good when I hear him speak from the pulpit. And so then they say to Rousseau, yes, my friend, but you have no money. So you're going to go down back to, and you become a craftsman. So that's, and his cousin, which had become like a brother, he went up to become a civil engineer. So you see, for Rousseau, this question of the apprenticeship is linked to a feeling of injustice. He's moved up and down, and he ends up down. So I think that plays a big part in the idea of Rousseau of leaving Geneva, because I do not believe at all his story that he found the door closed or whatever. He wanted to leave, and he found a very easy way to leave, because there were 70 other young men that did the same as Rousseau. They went to Mr. de Pontvert in the village of Confignon, who was the local priest, and he sent them to France to become converted and give them a little bit of money, etc., to start a new life. So what Rousseau did was not unusual at the time. Yeah, well, it was not. Most didn't do it, but it was easy to do that. And I think he did it on purpose. So I think that was all clear in his head. And it's only much later, as I told, when he was 40, that he suddenly realized that, in fact, he had lost a lot by leaving Geneva. You see, and then came all these ideas, yes, I should be a sovereign again, as a real citizen, etc.
We have another question over here, please.
I have a question. We placed Rousseau at the beginnings of the modern level of the state. 300 years onwards, I was wondering where the panel sees Rousseau's influence or relevance, perhaps, on actors that are placed on both sides of that spectrum. I'm referring perhaps on one side to the transnational concepts like your Union, United Nations, and on the other side, perhaps non-state actors, so actors that are sort of below the state level as an entity, but perhaps can still form, as we call it, moral entities or communities of interest. How do you see that? How do you see Rousseau on those two ends of the spectrum?
I'll say two words about that and then let my fellow speakers come in on it. Rousseau was very conscious that what he was providing was a model of a city-state. James Swenson mentioned that he didn't believe in representative government because that meant you paid somebody to make the decisions, whereas citizens had to be involved and had to do what was necessary, free themselves to take the time to do the deliberation, to make the decisions. So a small state, and one of his models was Sparta, which specialized in making war. In fact, it was a city organized for war. So Rousseau's thought does go beyond that level of the small city-state, but not to postulate the possibility of having larger individual states. But he does, using the ideas of the Abbé de Saint-Pierre, whose unpublished works he was asked to adapt for publication in the late 1750s. He does postulate a sort of the beginnings of a project for a kind of United States of Europe that would ensure perpetual peace, which was the object of the thing. And his political thought, he says himself, is not complete. The missing elements have to do with the transnational, it seems to me.
Yeah, but yeah.
Do you want to make a comment?
Yes. I think Rousseau was deeply suspicious of the ideas of something general that would apply to regimes that are completely contradictory. The idea that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights would apply and be supposed to apply to regimes that are totally in disagreement with even the basis of that, that is something that he was deeply suspicious of. So he was thinking, you need first to build communities. If it is so difficult to already make it work in the small Geneva, then how much more difficult to make it work at the general level. But then it's interesting to see that when the Poles came to Rousseau, he was deep in his depression. He was thinking that the whole world was against him. And he turned completely against Geneva as well, but thinking, oh, the Genevans are horrible. So at that time, suddenly the Poles come and say, don't you have an idea? Can you apply the social contract to the case of Poland? And for 6 months, Rousseau ceases to be depressed, does not think about himself at all, and he tries to find a solution for a very big state, which was Poland, very complicated situation with two very dangerous neighbors. And there he says things that he had told to the Genevans, particularly in the letter of d'Alembert. You see, the idea, you have to first build some sense of community. And he says something very interesting. He says, if you are going to be swallowed by the Russians, let's make sure that they cannot digest you. But in fact, he didn't want... He meant for the Poles to find a way to their independence, but then when the Poles were in fact swallowed by the Russians, then Rousseau became a sort of a prophet for them, because he said, at least they won't digest us. You know.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yes, over here.
No, I just wanted to respond to the question about globalization and Jean-Jacques. At some point he stated that the one country left in Europe that still had some of the purity that Geneva had before it became corrupt was Corsica. And perhaps you know it, Rousseau wrote to Rousseau and asked him, would he prepare a constitution for Corsica? And James Boswell visited Rousseau in Geneva and went on his behalf and traveled all over Corsica and wrote back and described it. And the whole point of Rousseau's advice was, do not associate with foreigners. Stay pure within yourself. None of this trade across the Mediterranean. And that I think was one of the most interesting interventions in opposition to globalization.
To globalization, thank you. Anybody want to comment on that? Otherwise, we are.
It's not a question.
No, it is.
It's
There's a
really
comment. Okay. With that, we will conclude this evening's program. We would like, first of all, to again thank our very good speakers, our very stimulating speakers, for an interesting evening. Before you leave, if you care to, look again at the display that we have put up for you of Library of Congress materials. We would certainly be happy to show and explain anything there. But before you leave, let's give a hand to our stimulating speakers.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.